All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. As I said, this is the UCR Library Workshop about text analysis tools from the HathiTrust Research Center. So thanks for joining us today. Before we dive in, I do want to start with this statement of solidarity. So I want to acknowledge that the pandemic and the other structural inequalities that we're living through have disproportionately affected people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous peoples. So as a member of the UCR community, I do stand with Black Lives Matter and Asian Pacific and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities against racism, xenophobia, and human rights violations. And I also want to recognize, because I'm physically located in Riverside, California, responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, as well as their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. And while we're currently meeting online and wherever you are calling in from, I do encourage you to learn whose ancestral lands you're physically located on at the website on the screen, native-land.ca. And definitely for today, feel free to engage in whatever way you're most comfortable. I will be monitoring the chat and am definitely available to follow up afterwards with anyone if you have additional questions. So my name is Rachel Starry. I am the Digital Scholarship Librarian here at UCR Library. And today we're going to be talking about ways that you could use the resources of the HathiTrust Digital Library and the HathiTrust Research Center tools to ask different kinds of research questions. And we're also going to kind of talk about some essential text analysis concepts, clarify some vocabulary, and talk about some of the research method that those tools that you apply. So again, the slides for today are available at this link on the screen, bit.ly/UCR-HathiTrust 2021. So if you would like to access the slides and follow along and access the links, that is an option. So what is HathiTrust? So HathiTrust Digital Library is a digital repository for the preservation and access of digitized content from a variety of sources. Those sources include the archives and digitized collections of member institutions, including the University of California, as well as, the Google Books project from the Internet Archive and from Microsoft digitization projects. So really a lot of different sources. It began in 2008 as a collaboration of the Big Ten Academic Alliance and the University of California system to kind of have a centralized place where they could store and share their digitized archives and collections. And it has expanded to include a lot more member institutions across the US. Essentially, the mission of the HathiTrust Digital Library is to contribute to research, scholarship, and the common good by collaboratively collecting, organizing, preserving, communicating, and sharing the record of human knowledge. They include, the HathiTrust collection includes over 17 million digitized volumes in a very wide variety of languages. It includes both fiction and nonfiction, so everything from novels and plays to government documents. Really a huge variety of types of works are included. As a member of UCR, if you're a UCR community member, you can use your single sign-in login information to access the collections, or if you are not located at a member institution, you can also create a guest login so that you can kind of go in and create your own custom sub-collections of the works in their collections. And just a note that access to HathiTrust looks a little bit different right now. So because library closures have kind of prevented folks from accessing a lot of the physical collections, for example, over 50% of the physical books that we actually hold here at UCR have been digitized and or are otherwise available through HathiTrust. So something called the HathiTrust Emergency Temporary Access Service actually allows UCR community members to access electronic copies of those physical books while the kind of physical books are not being lent out, for example. So there's more information about that on the UCR Library website. You can also just search for that on the UCR Library website. And we also have a research guide for expanded and free access to things online during COVID-19. So that is still applicable. So that's what the HathiTrust Digital Library is. So what is the HathiTrust Research Center and how does it relate? So the HTRC enables computational analysis of works that are in the HathiTrust Digital Library collection, and that includes both works that are in the public domain, so things that were published long enough ago or that have been intentionally released into the public domain, or that were not subject to copyright, like government documents, as well as things that are currently still in copyright. And the way that it kind of does that is through what's called a non-consumptive research paradigm. So the HTRC is physically located and co-located at Indiana University and at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The way that this kind of non-consumptive paradigm works is that the volumes that are in copyright are made available on a kind of limited basis, and the way that you interact with features that are extracted from those texts and the kind of results of the algorithms and tools that HTRC makes available for text analysis online and through things called data capsules. We'll get into all of that. It doesn't actually make the full text accessible to researchers directly, and the kind of those results can't be used to kind of reconstruct the entire full text. So you can read more. They have a non-consumptive research policy that is really interesting to kind of, if you're interested in copyright law, it's interesting. Otherwise, it's just useful. But that is kind of, they're committed to making those works available and allowing researchers to more easily access the collections and analyze the collections, including the in-copyright stuff. So before we kind of dive in and look at those tools in particular, I did want to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about, what is text mining and analysis. These terms are often used really interchangeably, and it can be kind of confusing what is being referred to with those different terms. And again, I'm just going to kind of skim the surface of this for the purpose of today, and I'll refer you all to the workshop recording that that was put on the UCR library website or on the YouTube account from last December, and I have a link to that in the slides as well. So essentially, there's a kind of basic agreed upon definition of text mining, and that is deriving high quality structured data from texts. So what does this mean, right? High quality means that, the data that we're pulling out of these texts is interesting in some way, that the computer is not just detecting noise, but that when we process and analyze texts into structured data, we're paying attention to patterns that are in some way new or relevant to, our research questions. Structured, of course, plain text, the text of a book or an article is unorganized, just strings of letters and numbers. So text mining techniques kind of allow us to make sense of that, detect patterns, and organize those characters, words, even sentences into an organized data model that can help us and really the computer recognize relationships among the words and documents. And of course, data means information, but more than that, that's really thinking about useful information, right? So treating texts as data kind of is intended to allow us to process large amounts of information that no human could really do on their own, and analyze that to help us better understand something about the texts. So at the most basic level, text mining, text processing involves several different tasks. So one of the most common is called tokenization. That is simply splitting up all the tokens or words into in a document so that you can kind of more easily count them and summarize them, toss out some of them. And you'll often hear n-grams being used as well in the context of tokenization, and that just refers to multi-word phrases. Or you can have a unigram, which is just a chain of n words. So a unigram would be one word, a bigram is 2 words, etc. Another really common thing is removing what are called stop words, as well as punctuation, right? So if we care more about the words that are interesting or unique in a document or collection of documents, then we prepare the texts essentially by removing words that we don't care about. So conjunctions and articles and prepositions, all those little words that, don't necessarily add to the kind of semantic meaning of the documents. It's also really common to kind of do simple counting sorts of analyses, but processing. So essentially looking at, term frequency, which is how commonly does a word occur in a document, or how common is a term across an entire corpus. And essentially, I'll use the word corpus a lot today, and you'll see it a lot in this context. It just means a body of text, so any collection of text is a corpus. So text analysis includes, processes that kind of go beyond the simple text mining technique. So if text mining is that process of creating structured data that we care about, information we care about from the texts, then text analysis methods are just the processes of studying that data. You'll commonly see machine learning and what are called natural language processing techniques, one of which is named entity recognition, and I call attention to this one because there is a HathiTrust Research Center algorithm for this in particular. So essentially, with text analysis, we're going beyond, simple counting to actually examine things like the semantic patterns in text. So, we care about things like the order that words are used in, or they're part of speech, or their meaning in context. So named entity recognition in particular, this is just the classification of words and phrases into, predefined categories like the names of people, organizations, locations, medical codes, time, date, numbers, quantities, all of those sorts of things. So we won't go through a whole lot more of the different kinds of natural language processing techniques. Again, I talk about that a bit more in the workshop that I did in December of last year. So what are some of the kinds of research questions that we can ask that people are asking using text analysis methods to study really large collections of texts, of documents? So some examples, we could study things like how an author style changes over time, or how genres develop. So was, for example, Shakespeare's vocabulary truly unusually large for the time, or something like that. We can test hypotheses about texts or passages. So we can kind of quantitatively compare the characteristic vocabularies of different authors or groups of documents, be able to kind of quantitatively describe their similarities and differences. We can also do things like investigate the history of a word or concept over time. We'll actually look at a HathiTrust tool called HathiTrust plus Bookmark that does this really specifically. We can investigate things like authorship attribution, right? So who might have actually been the author writing under a particular pseudonym, or which songwriter actually wrote a particular song that was published anonymously, that sort of thing. And we can also explore thematic language in texts. So are there particular, words or phrases that characterize the speeches of a particular person? For example, maybe Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches in different years, or, quantitatively themes across all the novels written by a particular author like Jane Austen. So lots of different ways that folks are kind of using these methods to ask big questions. Again, we have 17 plus million volumes in HathiTrust. So what can we ask the computer to do that we obviously couldn't do as just one or two humans reading the text closely? And again, there is a workshop recording that kind of goes into more detail about these particular things and looks at some example projects and case studies. And that is on the UCR Library YouTube page. Oops, no, I don't want to play it. All right, any questions so far? I want to check in with you all. Feel free to post questions in the chat as we go along. I know I'm kind of breezing through a lot of the text analysis stuff, but I want to have enough time to kind of walk through how to use these particular tools with you. So in particular, how have researchers kind of used the HathiTrust digital collections and the HathiTrust Research Center tools to do those sorts of analyses? So there's a couple of really cool examples that I want to share. So the first is a project called The Power of Place, Structure, Culture, and Continuity in U.S. Women's Movements. So this is a researcher named Laura Nelson from Northwestern University who built a work set of writings by organizations and individuals within the women's movements in 2 cities. So she was doing a comparison of both first and second wave feminism. I believe she was looking at texts from 1860 to 1975 across these 2 cities, Chicago and New York City. And so essentially doing a comparative analysis, including both text and network analysis to compare the ideas that were being communicated in a lot of the movement's kind of claims making strategies, ways they were describing and organizing and identifying themselves. So primarily she did this through identifying distinctive vocabularies being used in different times and in these 2 different places, and also used topic modeling to identify the themes kind of across writings. Another really fantastic example is a project called The Transformation of Gender in English Language Fiction. So a group of researchers explored, they used actually the HathiTrust collections alongside corpora from the Chicago Text Lab to explore, the changing significance of gender in fiction, published from 1780 all the way through the early 21st century, actually. So they analyzed a corpus of over 100,000 works of fiction, considering both the gender of authors and the signs of gender that they used in creating characters using natural language processing methods. So they actually kind of found 2 almost paradoxically kind of contrasting conclusions that gender divisions between characters, the way the characters were described, became kind of less sharply marked over the course of the 19th century. But at the same time, the percentage of fiction written by women authors dropped significantly, and the straight number and percentage of characters identified as women and girls also drops. So, at the same time that the language of gender and gender roles was becoming more flexible, the space given to women identifying authors and characters was reduced over time. So interesting ways that folks are using these collections and tools to kind of perform their research. So let's pivot now and actually start to look at some of these tools and talk about ways to kind of leverage the HathiTrust digitized collections for your research. So what are the tools that the HathiTrust Research Center actually provides? So I've split these into kind of 2 broader categories, and we'll look at each of them in turn, spending a little bit more time with some of the online analysis options. They're a little bit more accessible and flexible and usable depending on kind of your experience with text analysis. You don't necessarily have to know a programming language to use them, those sorts of things. So in terms of online analysis options, there is a really, really fantastic tool that I mentioned earlier for kind of visualizing the frequency of words and how they were used across time. That's called HathiTrust plus Bookworm. So that is a web app for visualizing word trends. The HTRC algorithms are slightly more advanced, but really honestly quite easy to use, and really they have great documentation and are fairly intuitive to kind of get set up and running. And those are web-based click and run tools. Again, you don't have to know any programming languages to use these, and we'll look at how to build your own customized collections in HathiTrust and run them through the HTRC algorithms today. And then there are some more advanced ways of working with HathiTrust data. So there's something called data capsules. Those are a secure computing environment, basically a virtual machine where you can kind of get your own workflows for text analysis set up and work with HathiTrust data. And then HTRC also provides some downloadable data sets that you can work with on your own computer, as well as a Python package called the HTRC Feature Reader, if that is a language that you use or are interested in learning. So those will allow you to do kind of more advanced analysis workflows using the HathiTrust collections and data. So before diving into looking at those, I want to kind of step back and talk about how you get started using all of these. So I'm actually going to hop over to these actual websites. So again, HathiTrust Digital Library is the the repository for all of the materials. So that's where you're actually going to be able to log in using your UCR credentials and kind of create your own searches and customized collections to kind of be able to easily find stuff and then import that into the Research Center for analysis. So this is a list of my, I only have one collection. We're actually going to build one together today. And you can kind of go in here and do both full text and catalog searches for all the materials in HathiTrust. And that is separate from the HathiTrust Research Center, which is analytics.hathitrust.org. Again, an affiliated research center located over in Indiana and Illinois. And here's where you're going to go, and you'll actually need to create a free account. So anyone can create an account who has a kind of .edu or institution, higher education institution email address. And again, it's separate from your access to the HathiTrust Digital Library. It is fairly simple to kind of get started. There's like an email verification process, but otherwise it's fairly straightforward. All right, so I am now logged in and we'll be able to use these services. Okay, so that is basically the kind of like login situation. So I'm gonna pop back into my slides here. So the first online option, as I mentioned, is HathiTrust plus Bookworm. And I'm going to go ahead and open up. So this is a link to the documentation page. And then this link will go to the actual, I believe this is randomized. I get different sample searches each time I open it up. And if you're familiar with Google Ngrams, this is actually a very similar sort of interface and tool to the Google Ngram viewer. So the Google Ngram viewer and the HathiTrust plus Bookworm allow you to kind of search for word frequencies in different corpuses over time. So if you can visualize multiple words together. So this is showing polka and mazurka and their frequency in the HathiTrust collection. This is searching all volumes. So this is 13 million volumes in HathiTrust that it's searching here. And one of the really nice features of this particular tool compared to the Google Ngram viewer, and I kind of almost demonstrated it. So I was actually able to click on a point in that line for polka, and it actually showed me the list of volumes that word occurs in, and then I'm able to go right ahead and pop in and view the actual document. So that's a really nice feature for polka in 1875. Google Ngram viewer is similar. You can kind of plot multiple words or phrases, but of course the corpuses that they're searching are slightly different. So HathiTrust plus Bookworm, this is, and they both kind of normalize by the number of books published each in a given year. So it's not just a chart of how many books were published in a given year. It really is word frequencies across time. So they do similar things, but HathiTrust, you're searching 13.7 million volumes, whereas the Google Ngram viewer is limited to Google Books, which is about 5 million volumes. HathiTrust is going to give you some additional information, as I showed, about the volumes that are actually being searched. Google Ngram viewer doesn't give you those, kind of volume level pieces of metadata and information. Both have limitations in terms of the corpuses that they're searching and the languages in particular. You can kind of filter in and out of different languages. So you can choose in Bookworm which languages you're searching. You can limit by publication country, by a lot of different, metadata pieces of information. So type of research, etc. It's really quite flexible in terms of its searching and restrictions. And the one other main difference is that HathiTrust may have duplicate volumes in its collection that's being searched by Bookworm versus Google Ngram viewer does guarantee that there's only kind of one copy per book, not filtering out extra editions though. So that is HathiTrust plus Bookworm. The other major component that we're going to kind of spend time looking at today, and I'm not hopping back into the slides full screen because we're going to be popping back and forth between different browser windows pretty soon. But the next major option that we'll kind of spend several minutes on here is the HTRC algorithms. So essentially there are 4 algorithms, and only really 3 of those are text analysis algorithms. The 4th is just a helper, and we'll talk about that later in terms of it helps you work with the kind of downloadable data sets. But before actually looking at these different algorithms, it is kind of useful to think about how that whole process of building your own custom HathiTrust collections, identifying the text that you do want to be working with, and then, what is that process for getting them out of HathiTrust and into the research center to be able to run those algorithms on them. So that's what I want to look at now. And I actually have a handout. So this is a separate link, which I will pop in chat. So this is a PDF that essentially walks through the steps of how to build collections in HathiTrust, and then how to get those materials out of HathiTrust and into a work set over at the HTRC, and the kind of steps that you need to go through. So this is here for reference after the workshop, yeah, just in general as a resource for you all. So yes, again, the first place that we kind of want to start is over here, and I apologize, my Zoom controls are in the way, so it's hard for me to like identify the browser tabs. So the first place we're going to start is over here in HathiTrust. So I, again, only have one collection that has already been created. So we can just walk through the process of creating a collection together. So again, you log into HathiTrust using your UCR credentials. And to start creating your own collections, you can go up to either My Collections or the Collections tab. They both lead you to this page that I'm currently on. And again, collections are just a way to group volumes, group items from HathiTrust. And you can choose whether your collections are public or private, but you're going to have a public collection if you want to import it into the HathiTrust Research Center using the kind of most streamlined way. And we'll look at that. So to make a new collection, there is a new collection button here within this kind of context menu on the collections page. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. So I already have made a collection. So for example, if you wanted to create collections and work sets to kind of do comparative analysis, for example, if I made this German archaeological publications of the 1980s, with a kind of case study in mind of doing, a bibliographic comparison of the sorts of titles in different languages that are publishing archaeological reports in different decades. So just an example of a way that you might be using this sort of digital repository. So if, for example, I wanted to compare the German publications to French publications, I could do that for the same time period. So I'm going to limit my search to mirror that of the German collection that I already made. I'm going to make sure this is public, and I'm going to just make this be a search for French publications in the 1980s, where the title includes any of the words archaeology or archaeologie in French and English. So I will hit save, and that will create a new empty collection. And you'll notice this resets to showing featured collections, all user created collections. And in fact, my new one just showed up there. So this ticked up from 6740 to 6741. I should have a German one. Oh, how I got logged out. Oh no, I hope that, oh no. This is unfortunate. Okay, it did remember me. I was worried I was gonna have to go through the single sign-in. Apologies. So it looks like, all right, so my collections are now showing the German archaeological publications and French. Oh, and it's marked as private, so I'll have to change that. It is empty, but I'm going to make it public and save changes. So the way that you get stuff into a collection once you've made it is through a search. So you can either do a full text or catalog search. Full text is going to search, for example, the full text of the volumes that have the full text available, whereas catalog's just going to search, metadata fields like title, author, date, those sorts of things. So I'm going to go ahead and do an advanced full text search, even though I really only care about things in the title. So I'm going to search by field. I'm going to search for volumes where the title has any of the words that I'm looking for. So either the English words archaeology and archaeological, or the French words archéologie or archéologique. And I want to limit this to things published in the 1980s to 1989. You can limit with additional search options. So full view is things that as a UCR community member, I have access to view fully, or you can even limit it to just your local library's collection. I do want to filter by language to just French publications. And we'll probably see that this is not perfect. Sometimes the metadata isn't 100%. I know in my German collection, which has 700 or whatever, 500 something items, there are definitely some publications labeled as German that have English or French or Spanish text. So I'm going to perform that advanced search for these filters for title and language and date, and I'm going to get 723 full text results. So it's pretty simple now that I have my search results to kind of get this into a collection. I'm going to actually have this page display more items because unfortunately you can kind of only bring them in 100 at a time. So I'm going to select all the results on this page, all 100, and then you can choose which collection to add them to, or you can even create a new collection right here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and add it. And you would then kind of repeat the process down here for, each additional page of search results 100 at a time. I do not know of any faster way to get things into a custom collection, unfortunately. But now if we go back over to my collections, we should have about 100 items in the French, archaeological publications. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click into here because the simplest way to get this collection over into the Research Center tools is to use this link. And again, your collection has to be public for this method to work. You can also download the volume information for the volumes in your custom collections and then upload that if you want everything to stay private. That is also an option. So I'm going to go ahead and preemptively copy the link to this collection. Any questions about making that collection? I know I breezed through that pretty quickly. All right, so once we have created a custom collection, or in fact, you can kind of work on collections other people have made if you want to grab the links to their collections. And you want to start to use the HathiTrust algorithms, which we're going to look at in a second. How do you get that over here? Well, the fastest way to do that is to go to worksets, the worksets page once you have logged in with your free account. And you'll see I've already created a workset for the German archaeological publications of the 1980s collection that I made. So I'm going to use this button up here on the just below the menu bar on the worksets page for create a workset. And you have a couple of options. So again, if you want to, you can upload a file with HathiTrust volume IDs, or you can import using the URL, and that's what I'm going to do. So here it's just giving us some text explaining that if you want to pull in information, you can use the collection URL, which I already have copied to my clipboard. So I'm just pasting that in here. And again, it has to be public. And then I will click Fetch Collection. And it confirms data retrieved from source. So it should automatically pull in the name and description. You can obviously update that if you want. I'm just going to leave it as is for now. And I'm going to make that a private workset. And then click Create Worksets. So now I have both of my collections that I'd made to kind of do this comparative study imported in here. And of course, I would probably have gone through and added all 700 search results to make this a more robust collection. So that is the first step of getting your collection in here. It's also a good idea to go ahead and validate your work sets as well after you've imported them. And the reason that this is useful is that HathiTrust Research Center has to kind of sync its data with HathiTrust Digital Library. And sometimes there are volumes that are in HathiTrust Digital Library that either aren't accessible via HTRC, or there's other reasons why a volume might not be valid to run in the data capsule environment or in these algorithms that we're about to look at. So it's always a good step to kind of validate a work set after you've created it. So here we're actually seeing all the work sets created by all the users in HathiTrust Research Center, but you can filter by just yours. So I'm going to go ahead and select the one I just brought in, the French Archaeological Publications. Again, you can also upload it to validate, and this is going to, oh, that's awesome. 100 volumes are valid. I believe for my German publications, one volume was invalid. So if you do find that there are volumes that are invalid, you could either download the list of valid volumes and re-upload that as a new work set, or otherwise remove the invalid volumes. Your algorithms will still run even if you have invalid volumes. This is just useful for knowing, okay, well, if 50% of the volumes for some reason aren't able to be brought in, then you're really only running the algorithm on 50% of your collection. So that is the step to validate it. And then the very last step is to go ahead and schedule a job. So before we look at how to do that, I will pop back over here and talk a little bit about what these algorithms are. Again, I do have a link to kind of walk through that process that we just did for reference later. Okay. So as I mentioned, there are 4 total algorithms, but only 3 of them are really text analysis methods. So the very first one is the token count and tag cloud creator. So what this particular algorithm does is identify the tokens or words that occur most often in a word set and kind of count up the number of times they occur. So it will output both the list of tokens and the number of times they occur, as well as a tag cloud or word cloud visualization of those most frequently occurring words, right? So you've probably encountered word clouds before where the largest words represent, the words that were most frequent in a particular document or collection. So, this is useful for kind of that first step of figuring out, what's going on in your collection if it's not a collection you're familiar with, to kind of just get a glimpse at what are the most frequently used words. So you could use this to compare the results of multiple work sets, right? So if I was looking at, for example, works of fiction published in different years, just getting a sense of the most commonly used words in different time periods or something like that. And you can always download the results of these algorithms and bring them into other data visualization programs to kind of create your own visualizations if you wanted to make a bar chart or other kinds of chart to visualize word frequencies. So that is the very first one. The next one that's fairly kind of straightforward is the named entity recognizer. So what this does is just generate a list of all the recognizable names of entities in the work set. And of course, you can kind of customize which kinds of entities to extract, but it essentially pulls out the names of people and places, dates, locations, times, and quantities. So like monetary percentages, monetary account amounts, those sorts of things. So that can be really useful, again, to compare across multiple work sets. Are characters listed in this one, or people listed in this one, or locations more frequently than in other work sets, as well as to just kind of, again, identify either known or unknown entities that are mentioned in the collection. And you can also export that again to create visualizations in other programs. Or, for example, if you pull out locations, you could do things like do georeference or geolocating those locations and plot them on a map. And finally, the last kind of text analysis related algorithm is the topic model explorer. So this one's a little more advanced. There's a few more parameters to kind of set. And essentially what it does, and it already sounds kind of complicated, it trains multiple LDA topic models. So before we go any further, what does that even mean, right? So very quickly, topic modeling, if it's not a thing that you're familiar with, the basic concept here is that, topic models are statistical models that describe the topics or the themes that occur in a document, but it's more useful on large collections, right? So less something you want to just run on a single book and more on like the millions of articles published in a particular newspaper, for example. And the way it works is essentially clustering similar words. So intuitively, if you know a book is about dogs, there's going to be a lot of dog words in it, right? Same thing if a book is about cats, there's going to be a lot of cat-related words in that. Most documents and collections, though, are, of course, a combination of many themes and topics. So in a book that is, 10% about cats and 90% about dogs, you'd expect, 9 times more dog words than cat words. So that's kind of a really rough example, but essentially the computer is going to go through and look for words that, co-occur, that are related to other words. Yeah, I'm not going to get into the math of that. It's a little too complicated, but another good example is this case study here where they actually ran topic modeling on 1.8 million articles from the New York Times. So these are really tightly co-occurring words. So there's kind of, it's then your job to kind of figure out what a topic really means. But obviously there are these kind of trends across the New York Times about music, publishing, art, sports, entertainment, politics, economy, that sort of thing. So it's a kind of, again, a starting point to investigate your collections more deeply. So to kind of come back to this description of the actual algorithm, it trains topic models, and then you can both view a bubble visualization of topic clusters, but you can also kind of download and look at those topic clusters and explore those more deeply on your own if you wanted to. So let's go ahead and look at these algorithms over here. So the way that you run an algorithm on a work set of your choice is by going up to the algorithms page on the HTRC website. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down and run the token count and tag cloud creator on my French archaeological publications work set that I just pulled in. So it gives you a nice description of kind of what this algorithm is doing, right? So it's identifying the tokens and doing simple counting. But again, thinking back to kind of when I was talking about text mining and analysis, there's a lot of kind of processing and preparation that has to go in terms of cleaning up raw text data before doing this sort of work. So there's actually a series of parameters that we have to set for this. So I always recommend giving your jobs a really specific name because it can be a lot more challenging to kind of identify. It's possible to run 10 jobs for the same algorithm on the same work set. And then if you've changed the parameters slightly, it's hard. You have to kind of click through each one to see, well, what did I change? So I'm going to give this a title. It's not going to be a very, I don't know why it's so laggy. Wow. It's not going to be a very specific job name, but you can add whatever details to the job name you think are useful for finding it again. I'm going to select, again, from my work sets, French archaeological publications. You have to specify the predominant language. I believe that should be French. And another really key, if you're doing multilingual or non-English analyses, which this will include a lot of non-English, it's really pretty important to point to a list of stop words in the language that you are analyzing. it's still not going to be a perfect solution, but this is going to be better and will remove all of those prepositions and pronouns and like kind of little things in that language. So I personally use this resource, StopWords ISO, for finding stop word lists. So I believe they have a French collection, and in HathiTrust, in the algorithm page for the token count, there is a place where you can put in a URL that goes directly to a text file. So this is the text file. If I pulled in, for example, I'm going to copy that. If I pulled in this URL here, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't actually pull in the stop words. So I'm going to paste in this text file for the French stop words list. And if you're using English, you can use the default that is provided. You can also provide replacement rules. This is a little more advanced and not super necessary, or you can use the default for that. And that's essentially if you want to replace a word with another word. You can choose whether to lowercase tokens. That's helpful if you want to have all instances of a word counted together. So like the word and, if it started a sentence, it was capitalized, would be counted separate from lowercase a and d. And then this is where you can customize which tokens should appear in the tag cloud. So this is this default regular expression only is going to pull out words that are letters or have a hyphen in it. So it's going to exclude any kind of like weird abbreviations and things like that in theory. And then you can choose how many tokens. So I'm going to scale that down a little bit and click submit. And honestly, we may not even have time to view it because it takes a little while to run. So the way that jobs get scheduled and run in here is that, well, they're running on a server in Indiana or Illinois. And so, you know, jobs can take anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes or longer, depending on the size of the collection you're running it on a lot of different factors. If other people have staged a lot of jobs at the same time, or there's a long queue. And you'll notice too that there is an expiration date. So the results of your jobs will stay on here for, I believe, 18 months. That's currently the kind of expiration date, and then they'll be deleted. So you will want to download the results of your jobs. So this is just going to take a little while. So let's actually hop over and look at a token count and tag cloud creator result. So I could look at the, I was experimenting with the German archaeological publications, and in fact, it is a good example. So the results of this are, again, a CSV that includes all the tokens, including, it did not pull out punctuation. So punctuation, a lot of this is going to be kind of garbage until we get down a little bit further in here into actual words. So you can download that CSV and view it on your own. And then it also has this word cloud. But again, we'll notice that it didn't do a perfect job of pulling out all abbreviations or, in fact, words in other languages that made it into this German language collection. So you'll notice some English and Spanish and French words in here. But it does start to kind of, if you kind of ignore some of the larger words, get into German archaeological terms that kind of describe this collection. But an example of needing to kind of clean up things, maybe, depending on the language that you're working with. But another great example here, and I just ran this algorithm on a work set, somebody else's work set, actually, of 19th century horror fiction. It's a collection created by another user of HathiTrust Research Center. And this is the tag cloud for that collection, for that work set of horror. So man and sir are quite large, but also time. So a good starting point, again, if it's good for kind of comparing across work sets or just creating this sort of visualization of the most commonly used tokens. Oh, and it looks like the job completed for the French archaeological publications. Cycle, that makes sense. Ah, figure. The abbreviation for figure is quite common. Fascinating. Again, it looks like a lot of English language terms also made it into this collection. I will go back up to the jobs list. So that's the token count and tag cloud creator. If we look at the named entity recognizer, it has a similar output, but without the visualization. So it will output a CSV spreadsheet file of all the recognized entities. So this is the one I ran on that 19th century horror collection. So we'll see locations were recognized, dates were recognized, people's names. And again, it's not perfect. So this is, again, a starting point there. It will kind of require a human touch, so maybe some processing and cleanup of this. But it could be a good starting point for seeing, how common are different characters, different people, different places, locations, all that sort of thing mentioned in this particular collection. So that is the named entity recognizer, which if I go back and actually run that, it's a lot simpler to run. It doesn't ask for a stop word list and all of that sort of thing. It just requires you to specify the language of the work set. So give it a name. I genuinely don't know why this is so slow. And then I will select the work set and specify French, and then schedule that job. And then the very last example is, of course, the topic modeler. So this is the topic model explorer. I ran it on the 19th century horror collection because the German archaeological publications, well, we can look at that if we have time to, but essentially it gives you this bubble visualization. And when you run the topic explorer, you select how many topics you tell the computer to look for. So that can affect the kind of granularity of your results. So if you tell the computer to look for or to expect 200 topics, those might be very specific clusters of words versus if you tell it to look for, there's only 10 topics in this collection of documents, and it's going to probably find much more general sorts of clusters of phrases. And it's up to you really to kind of investigate this, and again, it's a starting point for digging in. And honestly, they even specify that the axes of this visualization, the kind of implied X and Y axes, don't have any intrinsic meaning, but they do represent kind of how different the clusters of topics and words are from each other. So that's, again, a really interesting kind of starting point for investigating, or doing kind of closer reading and analysis. In the results for the German archaeological publications, I found this kind of interesting. A lot of the clusters that it found were actually clusters of words in other languages. So either in like quotations or documents that made their way in that weren't actually in German. So we have some English language words up here in these purple topic clusters. I believe we have some French. Well, these are all about Switzerland, actually, those words. And then we have some French clusters. And there were even some Spanish language phrases or citations or documents that got clustered over here by the computer. Recognize that those were different, quite different from the German. Again, an interesting starting point for kind of thinking about what is this collection about? And it is run in the same way. So you go to algorithms, you select the topic model algorithm, give it a name, select your collection. And here there's only two parameters: how many iterations you want the computer to kind of like, how many passes should it take reading through your whole collection? So a lower number is going to process faster, but a higher number gives the computer more time to like chew on the results. And then you specify how many topics, again, to look for, and that will determine the kind of level of granularity of the topics. So very quickly, beyond those algorithms, which are kind of the core of what I wanted to talk about today, there are a couple of additional options for tools that HathiTrust Research Center provides. So the third online option for this is the data capsules. Again, a data capsule is essentially a virtual machine where you can kind of customize your own text analysis workflow. So they come preloaded with some data analysis tools, everything from an Anaconda Python installation and R to Voyant tools. But we also actually have a local UCR Voyant tools instance now. And by default, the data capsules let you have access to the public domain works in the HathiTrust collections. But if you are a UCR community member or another member institution, at another member institution, you can request the access that includes the in-copyright works, and there's just some policies that govern what you can take out of the data capsule when you've done, when you're done, with your analysis. Basically, the results have to be kind of spot checked to make sure you're not pulling out anything full text. And then again, HathiTrust provides a couple of data sets for you to download. So this is where kind of that fourth algorithm comes into play. The fourth algorithm is the extracted features download helper. And that's going to help you select subsets of this really fantastic extracted features data set. So this data set, I believe, is 4 terabytes in total. So it's not a kind of thing you can just download and play with in Totem, or it would take a very long time. But essentially it contains information about the volumes in HathiTrust, as well as features, which are just informative kind of quantitative characteristics of the volume, including word counts, tagged with part of speech, numbers of lines, all sorts of pieces of information that can be really helpful for understanding the collection or the volume. So yeah, the fourth algorithm can help you download a shell script to run at the command line locally to just pull out volumes that you want from that derived data set. And there are some additional partner created data sets. I won't go through these, but essentially 4 different English language collections from the 18th century to 21st century, some useful kind of subsets of the HathiTrust collection. And there's links here to read more. And then again, there is a feature reader Python package. The code is on GitHub, and I have a recommended tutorial here if you want to get started doing text mining in Python using this feature reader package and HathiTrust data. So that is it. We're really at time. I apologize if this was a really quick run through, but I hope it was helpful to kind of demonstrate how to build your own custom collections in the HathiTrust Digital Library, and then bring those in and run the algorithms on them and kind of do some lightweight browser-based text analysis. So there's actually more. There's more tools available that I didn't have time to get to today. And then I have a link here to that stop words list. And the documentation site for HathiTrust Research Center is also fantastic. They have a really good wiki here, so a great place to kind of go next. So thank you all for joining today. I'm going to stop the recording now, but I will stick around for a minute or two if folks have any last minute questions. Thank you.